Welcome back to the Fierce Freedom Podcast. I'm Kat Morgan.
I'm Joyce Orth.
And today, joining us, we have our special guest, Dr. Janja Lalich. And yeah, she is going to be sharing a little bit about her work as a cults expert, really. And she's also going to be in Eau Claire. By the time this podcast goes up, I think we maybe will have passed the date, but still very much excited to hear from her. And please check out her work. And also for, those of you who did join, thank you for coming to that event since this is in the future. And yeah, we're definitely going to get into this with you today because we were saying this before recording, but there's just so much overlap with the work that you're doing, Yanya, and the work we're doing, which is educating about human trafficking and really that psychological manipulation and coercion that goes
Absolutely.
on is just so much the same. I mean, it feels like it's almost a formula. So
Yeah.
thank you so much
Yeah.
for joining us today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, again, your work is really dealing in the field of coercion within closed systems, and that's cults, relationships, again, human trafficking, ideological extremism. And I would love for you to share a little bit about what brought you to doing this work and becoming, this renowned expert, multi-book author on this topic.
Well, depends how much time you have, but I myself was in a cult in the 70s and 80s. I was 30 years old. I had a BA from University of Wisconsin-Madison. I grew up in Milwaukee, so
Oh my gosh.
I'm a local.
Our neck of the
She
woods.
said.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, I had just moved to San Francisco. It was kind of sort of the end of my hippie years. I'd been living on an island off the coast of Spain for 4 years. And so I was new in town. I met people. I was always sort of into social justice. And, I got asked to join a study group, not knowing behind the study group was a bigger organization. Anyway, long story short,
Mhm.
I got recruited. It was a left-wing political cult. We were going to make the revolution, blah, blah, blah. And it was very restrictive, very harsh. We spent most of our time sitting around in circles and criticizing each other. So when I got out, I was I was 41, almost 41. I moved to New York. I felt like I was 15. I was a complete mess.
Mm.
Um, Luckily, I got a really good therapist who helped me and kind of saved my life because I had a lot of guilt and shame because I had been in leadership and I was not a nice person. Um, and I even early on, I thought about, oh, I should go to grad school. And then I'd get these catalogs and I'd look at them and I'd get overwhelmed and I'd throw them away. And
Mm.
and eventually I moved back to San Francisco. And after 10 years after getting out of the cult, um, I got into grad school to get my PhD. And I was 50 at that time. So I always tell people it's never too late.
I love that. Yes.
And then and all that time I was going to conferences and meeting people and actually had already written a couple of books. But after I got my PhD, I got hired at California State University, Chico, where I was a sociology professor. And I think it was 2015, 2005. Anyway, one of those years.
Yeah.
I was teaching I think it was the social movements class, and I had them study human trafficking. And
Mm.
the class put on this amazing event for the whole university, and it was just awesome. And some of the students, when the class ended, some of the students said, we want to start a club, an anti-trafficking club. And
Mm.
they asked me to be the faculty advisor. So we formed a club called Stop Trafficking of Persons. It was the best known club on campus. We showed movies. Every year we put on a big conference. We invited big name people in the field like Shamir McKenzie and some
Mm.
of the top people. We did one session where you could get a certificate. They did some training. It was like a state sponsored organization. Anyway, that's what really got me into looking at
Mm.
trafficking
Mm.
and making that connection, because you're absolutely right. Not only not only the techniques of psychological manipulation that the traffickers use, especially the Romeo pimps, um, but also the recovery is very similar.
Would be.
Lack of self-esteem, guilt and shame, everything's the same. And the work I do work primarily with former cult members, and I have a nonprofit now, the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion, and I've only had a smattering uh, of trafficking survivors who've taken any of our courses or come to anything, which is, I've always wanted to somehow bridge that gap. It's like, I don't know who those folks go to, what kind of resources are out there for them. But it's always something I've thought about and wish I could like
Mm,
push more into that field. So
yeah.
anyway, I think what you're doing is great. I know there was just that case in Wisconsin where that young woman who killed her trafficker got
Crystal. Yeah.
like a life sentence or, something just
Yeah.
hideous. It's a
That was
perfect
disheartening.
example of coercion not being understood by the courts or by the
Oh,
legal system or by law enforcement.
I mean, absolutely. Something I'm thinking about too, as you're talking about with cult abuse and everything. I think one of the things that I think would be really hard about being a victim is the lack of understanding from an outsider and
Exactly.
and I think the assumption about that person that has been a victim. I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of
The
assumptions about
stigma. Yeah.
so much stigma with that. And
Yeah.
so, and as we saw, right, Crystal Kaiser, who now received a life sentence. And that was absolutely, in my mind, a complete miscarriage of justice
Yes.
because she was coerced. She was a child and she had been
Right.
abused by this man who was
Yeah.
also trafficking other people, other young girls, like 12 years old. Um,
Well, how
yeah.
did that happen? I mean, did she just not have a good attorney or, I mean, how
Oh
in
my
the world did
goodness.
that happen?
I really think it does speak to the stigma and the attitudes of people that are going to blame that victim and see her
Yeah.
as dangerous and just lock her up because it's
Oh,
like
Jesus.
we can't contend with this sort of gray area. I don't know. So
Yeah.
it's really disheartening. Thank you for bringing that recent case up because that is a
Yeah.
great example.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that has really struck me, I always make this comparison to domestic violence, not that everything's been resolved in relation to the amount of domestic violence that goes on, not only in our country, but around the world. But, you know, I think in that field, people did a really good job so that at this point, you know, the police are educated, like if they knock on the door and they're told to go away, they don't. And, there's
Mm.
domestic violence shelters everywhere in practically
Hmm.
every city and town. And I think people not so much asking, well, why didn't she leave? But in the cult world, and I'm sure also in the trafficking world, I mean,
Hmm.
I had a woman come to me recently, who was in a cult in Minnesota, actually. And well, no, the cult is in Michigan, I think. But anyway, it's up there
Hmm.
somewhere.
Midwest, right?
It's a food truck cult, believe it or not. Anyway, she was in for years, a very abusive cult led by a woman. Long story. She gets out, she goes to finds a therapist, goes to a therapist, tells her whole story of like 15 years in this cult, blah, 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 blah. And at the end of it, the therapist looks at her and says, well, why didn't you leave?
Oh
And
my.
yeah,
Wow.
and you're
How
like,
is
oh,
that
come
still the
on.
Mind
question?
blowing.
Yeah, like, come on, people. We've been there, done that. It's like, but
Hmm.
even the mental health professionals just have so little understanding of how to work with cult victims, the whole process of cult recovery, what the after effects are. I mean, it's just, uh, and I worked my butt off. I'm about to do another course for therapists, a CE course, but I'm one person and I've got my little organization, like you've got your little
Mhm.
organization, and
Mhm.
there are other people in this field, but the amount of work that still needs to be done is just phenomenal in both of these areas, cults and trafficking.
Yeah. I think coercion and manipulation are manipulation and coercion. Like they're so I don't think that we can kind of even if some of the details alter, I think that like you're saying domestic violence, domestic abuse, I actually use the same example in some of my presentations. I say, well, you would never say that now to a woman, like,
Right.
why didn't you just leave? So I think
Right.
that's a really good example, I think, of how we can sort of paint the picture. But I still think, yeah, there's this like idea of like, oh, she's a sex worker. She wants to be
Right.
there. And it's just so much more like nuanced than that. And I think that people don't deal well with the gray. I think they just want to
Mhm.
put it in a box and you
Yeah.
just kind of
Well,
can't.
I mean, look at our political situation.
Mhm.
Is there any gray there? I mean, I don't know what side of that you're on, and I don't
Right.
like to talk publicly about this stuff, but talk about black and white thinking.
It is so polarized, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was gonna say, I would love for you, because again, like even though this is so prevalent, I would love for you to share about that. But even, yeah, like we're talking about, even though it's so prevalent, it still seems like there's a lack of understanding and maybe you have resources, but I feel like there's just, yeah, I don't know. I feel like survivors of this maybe don't know where to go next. So
Right.
how is the, yeah, how prevalent do you think cults and closed systems really are?
Oh, cults. Oh, I mean, my cults are everywhere, everywhere, everywhere.
Yeah.
I don't like to say there's a cult under every bush, but there's a cult under every bush around the world. I mean, I'm about to go to New Zealand for 3 weeks because they just had a huge case blow up there with horrific child abuse of the children who were raised in that cult.
Mm.
Um, and it's kind of the first, even though there've been cult things happening there in the past, it's the first time they're having a big conference, and it's like a really big deal. They're having me speak to the parliament, and all of that.
Wow.
But I got contacted recently by a guy who has a nonprofit and in another country, and he asked if he could translate my book Take Back Your Life, which is about cult recovery. He asked if he could translate my book for his nonprofit in Sinhala. And I'm like,
Mm.
well, what language is Sinhala?
Mm.
It's Sri Lanka. This man was in
Wow.
Sri Lanka, and I'm thinking, oh my God, in Sri Lanka, there's a
Right.
need for my book on cults.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
who even knows where Sri Lanka is? It's like,
Right.
so your question, how prevalent? I mean, I can't even
Everywhere.
answer that question with a
Yeah.
figure.
It's kind of like trafficking. It's like there's just so many cases that go
Right,
unidentified. And
right.
even as you're
And I
talking,
think,
I'm
and you can tell me this.
mm,
I know when I was doing a lot of work at Chico State with the club and showing films and bringing speakers and all of that, there was still a real myth that only foreign women are getting trafficked. It's
mm.
not happening to domestic women. Is that still happening?
So the myth is absolutely perpetuated, and that's something we do have to fight against.
Mhm.
I think that there's been really like Hollywood examples have blown up and it just continues to. I think that people conveniently want to point to the border and they want to point kind of elsewhere because it's like they don't want to take responsibility.
Mhm.
I think that how we try to highlight that is that, well, we know it's been reported in Wisconsin in every single county, and we also can point to sexual exploitation and grooming that has moved online. So, one statistic I always cite is in 2020, child enticement went up 97.5%. And so we know that that could be abuse, but that could also be, trafficking. So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I think people assume. And it's like, it's not that that doesn't happen and there aren't vulnerabilities specifically taken advantage of having
Mhm.
to do with being a foreign national or, labor trafficking that takes place, but it absolutely is people that are have grown up in this nation. And because again, it's about vulnerability and it's about
Mhm.
locating on that Maslow's hierarchy, like what
Right.
is the is it, I don't know. I just had okay, wow. Feel like I could talk to you for like for so long about this. We just had we're doing a filming project, and one of our survivors that shared her story, again, it just went back to, and she was adopted, but she had like a normal childhood, and her mom, was very loving, but at the same time didn't talk about sex. It was very taboo.
Right.
And also she was very secretive, like she just learned that, and she just wanted like love, acceptance, and a boyfriend, and that was
Right.
it, like that was enough. And
Right. Right.
yeah, that's all
Yeah.
it takes. But
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to share something that the club did, my club at Chico State, which I just marveled at this. Um, we were monitoring the trafficking that happens in massage parlors.
Mhm.
And I don't know if it still exists, but at the time there was this thing online called Rub Maps, and you
Mhm.
could go and look at how many massage parlors are in your city. So if you
Right.
were a trucker and you were going to some town, you can, right?
Right.
And in our town, there were 15, um, you know, uh, massage parlors that were on that site.
Mm.
And almost all the women in those massage parlors were from Vietnam. Uh, and it was so the club decided they were going to try to make contact with these women and talk to them. And so we would meet every Sunday morning at a Pete's coffee shop, and they would get flowers from the flower shops, they'd get chocolate from the health food stores, and they'd go out in
Mhm.
teams. And the chief of police knew what we were doing. And every Sunday morning, in teams of 2 or 3, they would go and knock on the doors of these massage parlors, because in most cases, the women also live in those
Yeah.
massage parlors,
Mhm.
right? They would, and Sunday morning, there's not really business, right? So they would knock on the door and they would sit down with Google Translate, and they wouldn't talk to them about, oh, you're being trafficked. They just were befriending them. Like they would just say,
Mm.
we're
I love
students, we're
that.
going around to the small businesses, and just tried to make friends and have time and give them the flowers and give them the chocolate. I was so proud of them. I don't know that I could have done that. And I was like, wow, you students are really remarkable. I mean,
Oh,
That
I
really
was just,
is.
I was just so touched at the heart by that. I couldn't, I
I
mean,
love
anyways,
that.
it's something I always think about. And
It's so
hopefully some,
beautiful.
some
Yeah.
of those students have gone on and hopefully maybe are in this field.
Yeah. Yeah, it's about relationship and
Right.
and isolation. I mean, and this is kind of what we're talking about is like cult abuse and human trafficking. It's so to do with isolation. And I
Hmm.
think that the way out of that is connection and belonging. And because
Right,
that's really what I think people are looking for is like
right, right,
belonging and to belong to something that makes a difference, whatever that is, why
right,
you joined in the first place. But yeah, I think that that's counteracting so much of the psychological coercion and abuse
right,
and
right. And
restraint that they
in some cases, in most of those cases, probably those women don't even know what town they're in.
right,
They're brought
right,
over, they're shipped somewhere, they're driven
yeah,
somewhere, they're plunked in the back room someplace, and they didn't know they were in California. They didn't.
mhm,
I remember they raided massage parlors in San Francisco at one point a number of years ago, and the women there had no clue, that they were in San Francisco. I mean, it's just so whether it's the
mhm,
foreign women or
mhm.
our own
Either way,
American girls, I mean, it it just boggles the mind that more people don't know about
yeah,
this and aren't concerned about it.
yeah. And if American citizens are purchasing it, like we
Right.
need to take that
Oh yeah,
seriously,
yeah.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
the students. I mean, we used to
Mhm.
try to get the fraternities to like talk to their guys, and because I don't
Right.
know if this is still true, but again, back then, which was what, 10, 15 years ago, in my classes, I'd ask the guys, like, what was your first sexual experience or whatever? And they would say, oh, well, my dad took me to a massage parlor, or my dad took me to a brothel, and that was still a thing for dads to introduce their sons. And I'm like, really? Oh, that's creepy,
I didn't, yeah,
Absolutely.
that
Yeah,
is crazy.
yeah.
Do you do much research into how pornography feeds the industry at
I
all?
I don't now, but I did at the time. My students were doing that and doing a
Yeah.
lot of work on that. And I know that porn is a huge gateway into
Mhm.
men wanting that kind of sex.
Right.
And expecting it is normal,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like my dad took me to that's really crazy. So yeah, going into again the connections here, like what do you think that, somebody I would imagine it is really similar to somebody who's being trafficked and groomed, but what do you think some red flags are of somebody and maybe this is helping them identify like a listener right now or they're seeing that in somebody else. What do you think some of those red flags of cult abuse might be?
You mean what, while they're in or getting recruited or what?
Ooh, I guess that's a good question because however you want to answer that. I mean, I think that maybe of a cult would be interesting, like of an actual cult would be something. And then if you want to share what that could like, how that impacts people too, maybe over time.
Right. So I think, I can't just say every trafficking situation is a cult.
Mm-hmm.
I have a certain definition of cult that I use. And so I think it is on the spectrum for sure, that it uses the same techniques and it manipulates and coerces, whatever the word
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
coerces women in the same way, and men and boys. I mean, that's the
Right.
other thing that's never talked about, the boys
Right.
that are trafficked. And so I think, I think the one difference with cults, and you may know more about this, but one difference with cults is, uh, other than the kids who are born into cults, 66% of people who are recruited into a cult get recruited by a friend, a family member, or a coworker, right? If
Mm.
somebody invites you to something, and it's much harder to say no to someone and you trust that person. And there you are in this room where guru blah blah, blah is going to rise up off his chair and turn yellow or whatever.
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
Whatever.
Whereas I think with trafficking, it's much more either kind of a stranger abduction or some kind of, certainly for the foreign women, a lot of it is trickery, saying, oh, we're going to get you a job in America, that kind of thing. So I think the ways that people get in, other than the Romeo pimps,
Mhm.
that is exactly like a cult. The young woman is getting seduced, basically, getting emotionally manipulated into, oh, here's my boyfriend, he loves me, and oh, now he wants me to have sex with his best friend. Oh, and it kind of escalates from there.
Mhm.
That's very much like a cult. So I think red flags, red flags are if somebody's asking you to do something you don't want to do, don't
Mhm.
do it.
Mhm. Mhm.
And ask yourself a lot of questions about your own personal safety. And with cult stuff, I always tell people, like, if you're being recruited, like, ask questions, and if they don't answer your questions, that's a red flag. If they turn the question back on you, which happens
Mm.
all the time, they'll say, oh, you don't know enough yet to ask that question. Take another one of our workshops, then you can ask that question. And it doesn't work like that, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Or if there's not transparency about money and where the money comes from and where the money goes, and or if there's a leader that you can't question or criticize, right? There's this absolute authoritarian figure. So I think for cults, it's almost a little easier to identify them and point out the red flags. Whereas in trafficking, certainly if it's the illegal type of trafficking where you're just picked up and shoved somewhere, um, or it's a Romeo pimp, it's really much harder, I think, for someone, a vulnerable young woman in particular, to pick up on what's happening, or to have the guts to say, shit, I'm out of here.
Mhm. Mhm.
I
Yeah,
mean,
because when you said like cults are around like every bush or whatever, like I think that too that it's interesting because I think there's even cults like I would consider like MLM, multi-level
no.
marketing, and I think it's just there's a need being met or there's like, yeah, so I definitely see that overlap of coercion and you're sort of seeing how your life could be or there's these promises that are being made. And I think like with those it is a relationship thing. So I think when
Yeah,
you're saying that it's somebody that I think that is a really important part as well of trafficking where it's often a person that maybe you don't know initially but they start that grooming process where it may take some time but for them it's an
exactly.
investment and so they're going to like get to know you really well in that time,
Right.
to know how to groom you and how to control you.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly with cults, if I get asked all the time, is there a certain personality type who gets into
Mm,
cults? Isn't this stupid, weird, crazy, lazy people? And I'm like, no. And if there's any common denominator, it's idealism, right? It's people who want a better world, a better life, a better family, a better religion, a better whatever, right? So you've got this somebody comes along and offers you this promise of some sort of salvation, whatever that might be. It doesn't have to be religious at all,
mhm.
or spiritual. And if that resonates with you, you know, the message has to resonate, at least in cult situations, because like I always say, I never would have joined a meditation cult. I can't sit still
Mhm.
that long, right? But a political cult going to
Me
change the world.
neither.
Oh, I'm all there, right? Um, and so I think with trafficking, the kind we're talking about where people are groomed, it's the same thing where they're preying on, you know, the not just the vulnerabilities, but also the desires and goals and hopes and dreams of that person, right? And so
Mhm.
it's not that there's something wrong with these people, right? It's that we all want something, we all want meaning in the world, we all want purpose, right? And so that's what gets taken advantage of.
Mhm. Yeah.
And we
I
all want love. I mean, let's face it,
definitely.
even if
I
it's from
was,
our dog or cat.
What's that?
yeah,
I said, even if it's just from our dog or cat, we
I
want love.
right.
know. They're
Very
so,
much
they give
so.
it. They give it too. They're so great.
I was really fascinated when back in your story, you were saying how in the cult you were involved in, that you spent a lot of time in circles criticizing each other. And I wondered if that is typical of a cult and kind of also a red flag for,
Yes.
um,
Yeah. I mean, most cults will have, I mean, the whole purpose of the indoctrination process is to break you down, right? Is to
right.
attack yourself. So they want to sort of take you apart. They want you to doubt yourself. They want you to break from and doubt everything you ever knew so that they can rebuild you, right? So
Yeah.
whether it's sitting in circles and doing that kind of public criticism or standing up and giving a testimonial, you know, in your church or in your Bible group or in your MLM, you know, being criticized because you're not making enough money or you're not bringing in enough downline people. And in most cases, those critiques or attacks or whatever you want to call them, they're almost always done publicly. So it's about humiliation and shame and
Mhm.
making you feel like a piece of crap, right? But then they're going to build you up and make you feel okay again. So it's this kind of
Yeah.
seesaw. But there's all in almost every group, there's going to be some kind of you know, Robert Lifton, who was the guy who he's a psychiatrist in Boston who wrote the first book on what he called thought reform. And he called it the cult of confession, right? And one of his major criteria is what he calls the cult of confession. Like there always has to be that way that you're spewing out all the wrongs you did or you're being attacked for the wrongs you did, even if those wrongs are made up, which like in our group they always made up crimes of what someone did, and you're like, well, I didn't do that, but you couldn't say I didn't do that because you had to just shut up and take it, right? So
Wow. Wow. That's really
yeah.
interesting. There was I just think about like I watched the documentary about the Nexium cult on HBO, and there was this emotional collateral, and it was sometimes made up, and there would be images or there were like photos or there would be, yeah, it was just things that you, as you advanced in the cult, and you would get sashes as well. Like it was almost like
Yeah.
Boy Scouts or something, like you're getting
Yeah.
patches. And you're sort of ascending and then in this hierarchy. And yeah, and it was basically like, yeah, you're getting in the way of your own recovery and your own your pride. It's getting in the way of you ascending to your best
Right.
self. And so you need to be honest and you need to tell us everything.
Right.
And then
Right.
they hold that against you.
Right. And then they have everything on you. They know exactly what buttons to push. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
very common. Very
Yeah.
common.
Cause that goes into kind of my next question of like, not asking like why didn't they leave? But yeah, but how are people manipulated into staying in something like that?
Well, you know, I think as time goes on, in most cases, you've given up whatever friends on the outside. If you may have broken with your family by then, and a lot of you know, in some cults, you're told to actually write a disconnect letter to your family that you're not going to have anything to do with them anymore. So this becomes your new fake family, right? And it's everything you know, and the world and your world just becomes smaller and smaller, and so you're really in kind of an altered reality, right? And a
Mhm.
very closed. When I refer to the closed system, it's like you're in this group that's closed in on itself, and you're not allowed to entertain anything from the outside, right? And so as that goes on, you've given up more and more of yourself, and if you are internalizing all of the teachings, you then become like a little microcosm of the cult, right? So then you get to this point that I call bounded choice, where you get to this point where you know that any decisions that you make have to be made in favor of the cult, especially, and not little bitty things like, what do I buy at the grocery store today, but any significant decision, like, can I criticize the leader? You can't even think that, or should I leave? Oh, you definitely can't think that, right? Because leaving means losing everything, losing your salvation, losing probably your family, perhaps your children, losing everything you ever knew. Plus, the whole time, they're filling you up with fears about the outside world. So you think, oh, if I go out there, my life is over anyway. So this whole idea of free will and choice, your choices are completely constrained by the closed system that you're in. And so your free will is actually altered, and you begin to you are following the will of the leader, and as I say, the immorality. Your moral system becomes the immoral system of the cult leader. And
Mm-hmm.
over time, especially in groups where there's sexual abuse and violence and things like that, by then that has become so normalized that you don't even think about it anymore. Like, right? I mean, these groups that I'm studying right now in particular, where there's sexual abuse of children, and one really big church in Los Angeles, I mean, everyone was in on it. The mothers were grooming the girls to go into the
Wow.
leader's bedroom at 9 years old, because they thought it was a gift from God. It's like all normalized, right? So how do you break from that, right? It's like you're you're really living in this other world.
It's kind of that analogy of you probably hear this a lot, but it's just like the frog that you can't, I hate this because
Yes,
it's like, who's boiling a frog? But when you don't throw them into a boiling hot
exactly.
pot, you heat the water up around them slowly so that
Right,
you just are desensitized. It's normal.
right,
Um,
right.
did you have a question about?
But people do leave. People do leave.
Yeah, yeah. I really appreciate this, and I think like we were saying this, but I really feel that's true that the trafficker's role is so similar to a cult. I mean, I
Yes,
think that you also add in that a cult is like the family as what, you know what I mean? Like you're saying, it's like leaving. What do I do? Do I leave everything behind? I have nothing outside of
right,
this because I gave it everything. And so much control.
right,
Even in like I would say like a plain dress community, when I've talked to individuals who come from those. Um and I think that kind of even goes into my next question of like religious freedom and how there's sort of this feeling of in a plain dress community, for example, it's like we are above the law. Like we don't have to,
right,
the ultimate authority is the church, and
right.
that's within our closed system. And like people just, it's almost like even the government almost plays a role in that. Like, oh yeah, we don't have to be
You can't
checking on
touch
them.
religion, right?
Yeah, it's over here, and it's like, no, you're still a citizen and you still have to like abide
No,
by
I
the
mean,
law.
this comes up a lot. I do a fair amount of expert witness work, and in fact, I just did a case. It was a custody case where, one spouse joined some really troublesome fundamentalist church, and the ex-husband, didn't want his daughter raised in that, because it was all this hellfire and damnation and demons, and
Mhm.
just this fear-based stuff, and homophobic and anti-Semitic, and you name it. Um, and we just had the trial a week or so ago, and the attorney asked the wife, you know, um, do you believe you need to follow the law of the land? And she said, no. My law is God's law, and God's law is above all that. And of course, God's law is transmitted through this pastor who is the voice of God, right? But it's like, no, they don't believe they have to follow the law of the land. So when they asked her, if the court makes a decision about custody, things in relation to your husband, are you going to follow them? And she's like, I can't say that I am. Straight
That's
out said it.
right. Not the
Yeah.
ultimate authority.
Yeah.
And that's really, yeah. And
And
again,
that's
like,
where we're heading. And that's where we're heading.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I
Yeah.
would say that there's this nationalistic political cult as well. Like, I think, like you were mentioning, political cults and, yeah, and
Oh,
it's just
yeah.
a,
The Christian nationalism is really
yeah,
scary. Yeah.
yep, yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I don't have any qualms about saying that.
No,
I
we're in the
mean,
same boat.
yeah.
Right.
And I swear, I think even if Kamala gets elected, we cannot let our guard down because those people are so organized and so powerful.
Yeah,
They're not going to quit,
and
because of that.
yeah.
So we need to keep our eye on the prize.
And I think too, it's like, it's interesting how there's information that gets interpreted like, well, but so like when there's that person that you would consider to be the ultimate authority, even if you are presented, I think with like evidence that feels very like reasonable, it's like that coercion has just been
Right.
so much in there that you're like, well, no, but that was fake, or that was, you're
Right.
able to kind of
Well, and
justify it.
look at we have examples of these cult leaders who've been imprisoned, Keith Raniere from Nexium, which you
Mhm.
mentioned, or Warren Jeffs
Yep.
from the FLDS in Utah. They're still running the show from
Mm-hmm.
prison. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Raniere was a much smaller group, but the FLDS, I mean, there are still hundreds. They believe the whole thing was trumped up. He never did that, blah, 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 blah. There weren't child marriages when they knew damn well there were child marriages, right?
Oh yeah.
So it
Oh
because a
yeah.
leader is gotten rid of, that doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to go away or stop believing.
Yeah. It's like a
So,
hydra, I guess. Like, and yeah,
yeah.
I'm like, there's so much I want to say about that because we had this incident where we had a somebody reach out to us because I'm pretty sure that the FLDS has like reached into even like Menominee, Wisconsin, which is, you know
Oh,
what I
I'm
mean?
sure.
Like the rural, the labor, I would say labor trafficking even of the kids that
Oh,
are part
yes.
of that. And yeah.
Have you watched Prisoner of the
Oh,
Prophet?
yeah. What is it called? Prisoner and the Prophet?
Prisoner of the Prophet.
Oh, no, I haven't.
Watch that one. It's
Okay.
so interesting. It's about this woman who was the 65th wife of Warren Jeffs. And
No.
and he was always just like on her case. And at one point I mean, and I know a lot about that group because I'd gone to Texas when they pulled the kids out. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, at one point she got sent to this literally like a concentration camp up in North Dakota, so, somewhere out in the middle of
Yeah,
nowhere somewhere. So, yeah, they're all over the place still. Yeah, but
very
that's a
much.
great
They're
documentary.
breeding. They're
Yeah,
like breeding more members and
yeah,
it's so messed up.
yeah.
Did you have anything you want to add? I just before we
I just wanted to say that I had an experience at our church where we had um, several years of really deep spiritual abuse, and
Mm,
so many of the things that how you're describing these cult leaders,
hmm.
that was this pastor, and very charismatic, and he had the utter authority when friends would even come to me and say he threw this back at me, he used foul language, he did
Right.
this, he did that. I didn't really believe them, or
Yeah.
maybe not that I didn't believe them, but I felt like, well, if
there's a
he did
reason.
that, there was a reason
Hmm.
for it.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Hmm.
But you finally got out.
yeah, yeah, we're on the other side of that.
Good.
But there's still people that are suffering from what happened then.
Hmm.
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 And I've always wondered, was it a cult? I mean, we did have our exclusive language, and we did consider ourselves to be um, the church.
The be all and end all. Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sounds very culty to
it
me.
really
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As I'm sitting here and hearing the terms that you use and the
The
And
language.
descriptors,
I think
it's I'm there.
one of the things that is really problematic that's happened over the last I don't know, I guess several decades is the incredible explosion of these non-denominational churches, right?
Right.
Every storefront, every wherever, some guy
Yeah.
stands up, he decides he's the pastor, and he's not accountable to anybody, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the problem. Like if you're a Presbyterian or you're a Lutheran, whatever, supposedly if something goes wrong, you can go above the guy's head.
Right.
Even the Catholic Church, although that took forever. So, I mean, that's that's another story. But
Right.
these non-denominational churches, yeah, that's it. They're it, and the guy may even start out with good intentions, but they get carried away with their power, right? There's all these people
Right.
looking at them, and then, oh, look, so-and-so's wife, she looks cute. Well, maybe I'll go hit on her, right? Yeah, I mean, it just boom, it just explodes.
Yeah.
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 Power, and very much we were very prideful about who we were,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
The elitism, and that's part of the draw. People feel like they're part of something special. It's really hard to give that up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to just like Joyce, thank you for sharing that, because it's like you're a very intelligent, like well-spoken person. And I think that, I just want people to hear that it's not these, I don't know, I just having that understanding of who really is drawn in. And a lot of times it's like very intelligent people that
Absolutely.
like you
That's
said,
who
are maybe wanting the world to be better or
Right.
feel that
I mean, that's
conviction
who
of
cult
service.
want. Cults want people who are going to work for them, bring in money, bring in contacts, and,
Right.
write the documents, do the dirty work. Cult leaders are pretty lazy. They don't do very much. So they
Right.
have to recruit people. So they aren't going to recruit lazy people. They aren't going to recruit somebody who's really ill or a little mentally unstable. We had somebody in our group like that at one point, and we kicked her out. We're like, this isn't right for you. I mean, that's very
He
common.
did
No, they don't
that.
want that. They
He did
want
that. He
the
had
best and the brightest.
anybody who was disabled, they got kicked out of the sanctuary and had to watch in the secondary space. And
In
eventually
your
they were,
church, and this is a
yes,
church. Yeah, yeah.
yes. And eventually they weren't welcomed anymore at all,
Oh my
including
God.
his own father.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my
Well,
gosh.
that's very Christian.
Yeah,
Very
that's the
Christian.
Christian values.
They will
No.
know us by our love.
Yeah,
Yeah. I had an
yeah.
experience with like a campus ministry too that was a little culty. And I remember a conversation with another girl. And this was kind of the thing for me because I'd given so much to it. And I'm so excited you're talking on the college campus, like where this happened even. And this girl, I had said, basically, I was trying to have a conversation with her and I said, I think you have a lot of spiritual gifts. And then she said, I think you have a lot of spiritual gifts too, but I don't think you use them. And I had given so much, it was just like this job, this cult, this experience. I called it a job. And that was honestly true. Like it felt like a job. It was just like
Yeah.
so consuming. And so I think that, yeah, I think it's really good to see, even if it's like a little culty, but it's just like that. It's so, yeah, it's so prevalent. And I was almost thankful, like looking back, like she just said it. And I'm like, wow, I'm really not good enough. Like you're saying, it's like
Yeah.
eventually people just, I think, are almost eliminated from that because it's like this impossible standard of
Right.
perfection that I don't even think the cult leader is able to do. I think even too, it seems like people within those situations are just so focused on being perfect and following this insane like standard
Right.
that
Right.
they're like, I need to be perfect so that they don't even pay attention. They can't even see how messed up
Right.
it is because they're just so
Exactly.
focused on
Yeah, you're not
performing.
thinking straight, and you're exhausted, and you're probably not
Yeah.
eating well, and all those things add up.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's so good. So I'm glad we could
Right.
have a little therapy
Yeah.
session. I would love to hear, Janja, too, like how for a person to want to begin this journey out, after maybe self-identification. And even if you would like be willing to share what this maybe look like for you, how did you begin this journey out of the cult that you were involved in?
Well, I mean, for me, initially, like I said, I moved to New York and I was 41 and I was lucky I got a job because in the cult, one of my assignments was to build a publishing house. So I learned all about publishing. So I figured I'll get a job in New York, and I did. Um, but then I was and this is a really common phrase among people who leave cults. I felt like I landed from Mars. I mean, I didn't know anything about anything. Here I was in the cultural mecca, right? New York City. I'd seen 3 movies in 10 years, and those were only Star Wars movies because that's what
Mm.
our leader wanted to see.
Oh,
I didn't know anything about anything, and I'd have to go on these business lunches, and I would just feel like a complete idiot. Um, I did fine at my job, but at night I would try to write, and I would just like break down in tears, and I didn't know what was going on. And I was like, this is really weird. And then uh, I had a second job proofreading for my boss because he also had a publishing house, and I was proofreading the very first book on PTSD. And I'm reading the chapter on Vietnam vets, and I'm reading, these big sheets, when you're proofing these big pages, and I'm sitting at my desk and I'm reading what these veterans are experiencing. And I just thought to myself, this is what I'm experiencing. And I just like burst out crying. And I was like, holy shit. And then that very same week, my boss took me out for lunch. It was like my 6-month anniversary, took me out for dinner. And in the middle of the dinner, he says, oh, Janja, your work is just great. Your writing is great. Da, 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 everybody, everything's great. He said, but I just want to say, you've been here 6 months and I've never seen you smile and I've never heard you laugh. And I was just so taken aback because I always thought of myself as this kind of funny person. I make jokes and I realized I had no idea what in sociology we say your presentation of self. I had no idea how I came across to people. I was just like so separated from myself, right? So those 2 things happened in the same week, and I thought, I need help. I need help.
yeah.
And fortunately, in New York at the time, there was a cult clinic.
Mm.
And there were 2. There was one in LA and one in New York. And the therapist there knew about cult recovery. And it was cheap. It was like, I think I paid $10 a session. And I got this fantastic woman. And as I
Wow.
was saying earlier, I just kept saying to myself, how did I become that person? How did I become that person? Because I was such a bitch in the organization, because that's what we had to be. And I
Mhm.
modeled myself after the leader who recruited me. So and she absolutely saved my life. But that journey, I mean, that journey is very necessary, because if you don't do the recovery, you're going to end up in another cult. You're going to become what we call a cult hopper, because you're not going to
Mm.
recognize what happened. And so it's really important to go through that process. And it's rough, and it's a roller coaster, and it goes up and down. And there's days when
Mm.
you don't want to deal with it at all, and that's fine. And then there's times when that's all you want to do is think about that and deal with it. And it takes time depending on how long you've been in. I would say that for somebody who's been in any length of time, and I don't want this written in stone, but it's about an average of, I'd say, 5 years before you feel like you know who you are again. And for children, it's a whole other kettle of fish. Can't even talk about that at this point. It's too much to go
Mm.
into for kids who are raised in cults, because they didn't have a pre-cult personality. I at least knew I had lived in Europe. I had been to college. I had friends, I was 30 years old. And I eventually could remember all that stuff. But for the born-ins, it's a whole other thing, and the needs are very different and the challenges are very different. But it's definitely a journey worth taking. I mean, you want to, as my book says, you want to take back your life. You want to be who you were meant to be.
Mm.
And it's sometimes painful process, but it's really important. And
Mm.
finding the right people who can help you, that's always an issue. Um, what's good today, because of the pandemic and everything going virtual, is that there are support groups, like online support groups with other former members. And most people find that really, really helpful, because it's a safe
Mm.
space and people know what you're talking about, and they're not going to look at you like you're nuts, or what the. So support groups can be very, very helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And thank you
But
for sharing and the journey that you took took on of recovery. I'm so thankful that you did and that you are now here before us, like able to just really tell us more and to have, the Lalich Center that people can have, that would have been great for you if you would have
yeah.
had that. But thankfully, you found somebody
Yeah.
who could help walk alongside you. So you're doing that for other
Yeah.
people, which is
Yeah.
so amazing.
Yeah. I mean, right now we're actually doing this music workshop for survivors, and the first session was last Monday. And it was this music therapist from New York does the workshops, and he normally works with gang members, like in the prisons and stuff. And he's done this for us before, but so I went to that first session, and it was just so amazing to hear people speaking about, because everybody has some relationship with music that probably got really fucked up while you were in the cult, right?
Right.
And so just, I mean, the emotion was like, whoa, it was an amazing thing to be, I just feel so honored. I mean, everybody thanks me and says, oh, you're great. It's like, I feel honored to be able to do this, really, because it's so moving, and so it's really so just,
Rewarding. Yeah.
heartfelt, I guess is the word.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one piece of advice to people who are listening, who might think about leaving: if you have documents and memorabilia and stuff from the cult, do not throw it away. I know you don't want to look at it and you don't want it around the house, so put it somewhere, put it in storage, put it somewhere where you can kind of forget about it, because you never know. One day you're going to want to write a memoir, and that stuff's going to come in really handy. Or there may be a lawsuit, and you may have evidence that could help with that lawsuit. So
Okay, that's
don't throw
good.
the stuff away.
Yes. That speaks to healing that has happened, that you're able to, have that stuff in your life, and it's
Yeah,
not just, it's also like a piece of you, and you're like, I came through this, this isn't something that you just want to say, oh, I can't even, look at that shame.
right.
It's like, no, don't be ashamed, and don't feel like you're alone in that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and I was just wondering too, if there were, speaking to the people that are listening who are like, oh, wow, I've not been in a cult, or I don't, I'm a professional or a community member. What do you think might be some important reminders for them seeking to support this population?
Well, I think first of all, if you know someone who's in a cult, or you have a family member in a cult, don't ever say to them you're in a cult.
Mm,
Just be there for them in the most neutral way you can. If you still have contact with them, stay in touch as best you can. Don't bug them, don't confront them, send them their favorite chocolate chip cookies, send them little gifts if you can, remind them of happy times together. Don't, and just in whatever way you can convey that you are a safe haven. If they ever want to make a change, you are a safe haven for them. And if somebody comes to you like that, just let them do whatever they need to do. If they need to sleep, let them sleep. If they want to talk, let them talk. If they don't want to talk, don't make them talk. Let them go through that process on their own, and don't nudge and bother people.
really
Um,
good.
and, I would just say, be as supportive as you possibly can. If you're somebody with money, give money to organizations that do this kind of work, like mine, like the Lalich Center,
Yeah,
right?
please.
If you have connections, if you have, connections to lawmakers, get the law to understand coercion, get some laws passed in every state. I mean, there's lots of things that can be done at all different levels.
hmm Um, is it okay if we keep going until 2? Because I have like 2 more questions. And are you,
Okay, okay, okay.
do you need to go? It's totally fine if you gotta go.
Yeah, actually, I probably should go. I have
Okay,
to
okay.
pack. I have so much to do. I'm leaving tomorrow morning, so I
Yeah,
just have
yeah. Thank you so much.
we can talk when I see you.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah. I just
I
want to
look
say
forward to
though,
that.
yeah, it's such an honor to talk with you, and this has just been such a wonderful, like, I really appreciate that, and kind of grappling as well with like the intricacies of like trafficking versus this,
Yeah,
and the similarities there. So,
yeah,
I feel like I've learned a lot talking to you, and I would really encourage people to check out, the Lalich Center and your books. You have so many: Take Back Your Life, Recovering from Cults and Abusive Relationships, Bounded Choice, True Believers in Charismatic Cults. Um, so please, everyone, check those out. Obviously, you just have that lived experience, and you're just such a warm, connective person. And
thank you.
I'm so thankful that we were able to have this conversation with you.
Oh,
So
thank
thank
you.
you.
And it was great to be here. It was fun, and I'm glad you invited me. So,
Yeah,
and I'll see you in a
absolutely.
few days.
See you
Yes.
then.
See you
Thank you so
soon.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks. Have a
Take
good
care.
day.
You too.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.